Have you ever noticed how a company can smile at you through a customer service call while the person on the other end is crying in the break room before their shift? And that is not an accident, that is a business strategy. And today we are exposing exactly how it works. This is not a story about one bad company. This is a story about a pattern so widespread, so deeply baked into modern business, that most of us have experienced it without even realizing what we were actually witnessing happening right in front of us. Think about the last time you had an amazing customer experience. The staff was friendly, the service was fast, and everything felt smooth and effortless. Now ask yourself this: did those workers look genuinely happy, or did they look like they were performing happiness because they had no other choice? There is a term in psychology called emotional labor. It means being paid to manage your feelings and display certain emotions even when you do not feel them at all. And most customer-facing jobs are almost entirely built on demanding this from workers every single day they show up. Emotional labor is exhausting in a way that physical labor is not. When your body is tired, you can rest it. But when you are told to smile, be warm, be endlessly patient, and never show frustration, the exhaustion goes somewhere deeper, and it does not just disappear when the shift ends. And here is the fascinating and disturbing part. Companies have studied this. They know exactly what they are asking of their workers. They have entire training programs designed to maximize how well employees perform emotions for customers, and they invest heavily in those programs while cutting corners on actual employee well-being consistently. So why do companies do this? Why would a business pour resources into the customer experience while simultaneously underpaying, overworking, and undervaluing the very people delivering that experience? The answer is actually rooted in something very specific about how companies measure success and what they choose to count and what they choose to ignore. Customer satisfaction scores are measurable. A bad review online is visible. A customer who leaves never comes back, and that loss shows up somewhere in the data. But an employee who is quietly burning out an employee who stopped caring 3 months ago, that damage is invisible until it suddenly and catastrophically is not. This is the first psychological principle at play here. Companies respond to what is visible and measurable. The customer experience is highly visible. Employee well-being is largely invisible. So companies optimize for what they can see and hope the invisible stuff just holds together long enough to not become a problem for them. Now let us talk about the power dynamic and why it makes this whole thing so much worse. A customer can leave. A customer has options. A customer can go to a competitor, write a bad review, or simply never return. That threat gives customers enormous power, even when they do not realize they have it. An employee, on the other hand, especially a low-wage customer-facing employee, often cannot just leave. They have bills. They need the health insurance. They have a family depending on them. That lack of options removes their power, and companies absolutely know this, and they factor it into their decision-making, whether they admit it or not. There is actually a name for this in organizational psychology. It is called the exit voice and loyalty model. When people are unhappy, they can either leave, they can speak up, or they can silently endure. Companies know employees are far less likely to exit, and so they stop listening to their voice entirely. Customers exit all the time. Employees endure. And so companies build their entire culture around keeping customers happy, while quietly banking on the fact that employees will stay quiet, absorb the pressure, and keep delivering that polished customer-facing performance, day after day, no matter what is happening behind the scenes. But wait, it gets more complicated, because this is not just about greed. There is actually a genuine psychological belief inside many companies that the customer experience is the product. That if the customer has a great time, then the company is succeeding and everything else is just a cost to be managed and minimized. This belief is incredibly powerful inside boardrooms. It goes something like this: if we train our staff well and customers love us, then we are winning. The employee experience is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The customer is the mission. Everything and everyone else is just infrastructure supporting that mission. And this mindset gets reinforced constantly from the outside. Wall Street rewards companies for customer growth and retention. Business media celebrates brands with cult-like customer loyalty. Nobody is writing headlines about employee satisfaction scores. The entire external feedback loop companies receive pushes them further toward customers and further away from their own people. Now here is where the psychology gets really dark. Some companies have figured out that you can actually use the customer to discipline the employee. If a customer complains, an employee can lose a shift, get written up, or even get fired. The customer becomes an unpaid and unknowing enforcement mechanism for management control. This creates something deeply psychologically harmful for employees. They are now afraid not just of their manager, but of every single customer interaction. Every conversation becomes a potential threat. Every difficult customer becomes someone who holds power over your livelihood. That level of constant threat response is genuinely damaging to human mental health over time. And the really twisted part is that the company then markets this as accountability. We hold our staff to the highest standards. Customers are always right. We take every complaint seriously. What they are actually saying is we have outsourced discipline to our customers, and our employees have no protection from that arrangement whatsoever. Think about how this plays out in real life. A customer is rude, abusive, or completely unreasonable. The employee has to smile and take it. If they push back in any way, they risk a complaint. So they absorb it. They internalize it. They go home carrying something they were never given the tools to process. There is research from the University of Florida showing that employees who have to deal with rude customers are more likely to behave badly at home after their shift. They take the emotional damage home with them. It spills into their families, their relationships, their mental health. The company never accounts for any of this. So we are now starting to see the full picture. A company that treats customers better than employees is not just making a business decision. It is making a psychological decision. It is deciding whose humanity matters more. It is deciding who deserves dignity and who just needs to perform dignity for someone else. And here is what makes this so hard to fight. Most employees genuinely care about doing a good job. They take pride in helping customers. They do not want to give bad service. Companies exploit this pride ruthlessly. They use an employee's own values against them to extract labor that would otherwise require much better compensation. You will hear managers say things like, "We are a family here," or "Our people are our greatest asset," and in the same breath, those same managers will deny a raise, refuse flexibility, and write someone up for being 2 minutes late. The language of caring is used to extract the behavior of caring without providing the reality of caring. This gap between what companies say and what they do has a name in psychology. It is called organizational hypocrisy, and it is one of the most damaging things that can happen inside a workplace, because once employees recognize the gap, they do not become less loyal slowly, they become completely and suddenly disengaged overnight. And this is the moment where the whole strategy starts to collapse. Because here is what companies get wrong. You cannot sustainably separate the employee experience from the customer experience. They are connected at the root. A worker who is treated well treats customers well, not because they are trained to, but because they genuinely want to. There is actually a concept called the service profit chain developed by researchers at Harvard Business School. It lays out clearly that employee satisfaction leads to employee retention, which leads to better service, which leads to customer satisfaction, which leads to profit. It is not complicated. It is just inconvenient for short-term thinking companies. The service profit chain was not a radical idea. It was a documented, measurable phenomenon. Companies that invested in employees saw better customer outcomes. The research was clear, but despite being published in 1994, most companies still behave as if employee well-being and customer experience exist in completely separate and unrelated universes. Why do companies ignore research that would clearly benefit them? This is where we get into a particularly fascinating area of organizational psychology called present bias. Companies and the humans running them are wired to prioritize immediate visible wins over long-term structural health. Training a smile is cheaper and faster than building real culture. Fixing the employee experience requires changing compensation structures, improving management training, rethinking workloads, and building genuine psychological safety. That takes years. Training someone to say, "Have a nice day" with warmth takes one afternoon. And the quarterly earnings report does not care which one you chose to invest in this year. So the cycle continues. Companies take the shortcut. They train the performance. They measure the customer score. They post the profit. And somewhere in the background, their actual people quietly break down piece by piece, and the company just keeps hiring new ones to replace them and calling that a talent pipeline with a straight face. Let us zoom in on specific industries, because this pattern shows up differently in different places, but it shows up everywhere. Let us start with the one almost everyone has experienced directly: the fast food and quick service restaurant industry, where the gap between customer experience investment and employee investment is almost unbelievably wide. These companies spend enormous amounts of money on menu innovation, store design, app development, loyalty programs, and marketing campaigns. They want your experience in their restaurant to feel fun, easy, and satisfying. Meanwhile, the workers making your food are often earning minimum wage with no benefits, unpredictable schedules, and zero job security to speak of. The physical environment is designed for you, the customer. Comfortable seating, good lighting, pleasant music, easy ordering systems. The environment for the employee is the exact opposite: hot, chaotic, understaffed, and relentlessly fast-paced, with managers hovering and timers running and absolutely no room to be a human being for even a single moment. And yet the company will run whole advertising campaigns celebrating the workers. They will put a smiling employee on the billboard. They will post content about their amazing team on social media. That worker becomes a marketing asset for the company, while their actual experience at work remains completely unchanged and often gets worse, not better. Now let us talk about retail. The retail industry has perfected the science of the customer experience. Store layouts are designed using psychological research. Product placement is optimized. The checkout process is engineered to feel smooth. Loyalty programs are crafted to create emotional attachment. All of this is brilliant and expensive and customer-focused entirely. Meanwhile, the retail worker stands on a hard floor for 8 hours without a guaranteed break. They are expected to be cheerful through holiday rushes, through angry customers, through theft incidents, through being followed around by suspicious loss prevention. And when the company has a bad quarter, the first budget cut is always worker hours. There is something particularly revealing about how retail companies handle the holiday season. They hire massive amounts of temporary workers to handle the customer surge. Those workers are trained fast, thrown onto the floor, and expected to perform at the same level as experienced staff. Then in January, they are let go with zero ceremony. The customer never knows any of this. The customer sees a staffed store, a short wait, and a helpful person. The experience is preserved. The system worked exactly as designed. The temporary worker served their purpose and is now gone, and the cycle will repeat again next year and the year after that, infinitely. Now let us move into the world of airlines, because if you want to see the absolute extreme of this pattern, airlines are a masterclass. Airlines have elite status programs, personal lounges, priority boarding, personalized service for high-value customers, and entire teams dedicated to managing the experience of their best customers around the clock. At the same time, airline workers, especially flight attendants and ground staff, operate in some of the most psychologically and physically demanding conditions in any industry. Irregular hours, time zone disruption, cramped working conditions, difficult passengers, and a labor structure that often means working significant hours before even reaching minimum pay guarantees on a given day. Flight attendants in particular are required to present a calm, composed, and warm presence under conditions that would stress almost anyone. Turbulence, medical emergencies, passenger conflicts, crowded planes, and all of this while maintaining the brand image of the airline. The performance requirements are extraordinary, and the psychological cost is rarely acknowledged by the companies involved. And yet airlines spend massive money on customer experience research, on seat design, on in-flight entertainment, on lounge decor, on loyalty program benefits. The investment in customer experience is constant, visible, and celebrated. The investment in worker well-being, by comparison, is minimal, reactive, and almost always only happens after a public controversy forces their hand. Let us shift now to technology companies, because there is a fascinating version of this story that plays out in the tech world that looks very different on the surface, but is actually the same psychology, wearing nicer clothes and sitting in a better designed open-plan office with a ping pong table nearby. Tech companies are famous for incredible customer products. Beautifully designed apps, seamless user experiences, intuitive interfaces, and constant innovation aimed at making the customer's life easier, better, and more enjoyable. The customer experience in tech is often genuinely extraordinary and represents billions of dollars of thoughtful, intentional investment by very smart people over many years. But look at what happens to the contractors and gig workers and content moderators who power those same platforms. Content moderators spend their days looking at the most disturbing content imaginable to keep your feed safe and pleasant. Many develop genuine trauma symptoms. Several lawsuits have revealed the shocking psychological damage done to these workers consistently. The user of the platform never sees any of this. They see a clean, safe, enjoyable product. They have no idea that somewhere a human being sat through hours of violent content so that their experience could remain comfortable. The company kept the customer experience pristine and quietly paid the human cost elsewhere, where no one was watching. This is a particularly modern and troubling version of the original pattern. As companies have gotten bigger and more complex, they have found increasingly creative ways to distance themselves from the human cost of their customer experience. Outsourcing, contracting, and the gig economy are all partly mechanisms for keeping that human cost invisible and deniable. When a company hires a contractor rather than an employee, they can say those workers are not really ours. When a platform says its drivers are independent operators, not employees, it removes the obligation to provide benefits, protections, or real consideration for those workers' well-being. The customer experience remains seamless. The accountability disappears entirely into fine print. Now, here is a question worth sitting with. Are there any companies that genuinely get this right? Are there businesses that actually treat their employees well? And does it actually show up in the customer experience the way the service profit chain research says it should? And the answer is yes, there are a few. One of the most studied examples is a company called Costco. For decades, Costco has paid workers significantly above the retail industry average, offered genuine benefits, and created an environment with relatively low turnover for the industry. And their customer satisfaction scores and financial performance have consistently beaten competitors who pay workers far less than them. What is fascinating about Costco is that their model is not a secret. It has been written about, analyzed, and celebrated for years. Other retailers could copy it. Most choose not to, because copying it requires accepting lower short-term margins and prioritizing people over quarterly numbers, and most public companies simply cannot bring themselves to do that. Another frequently cited example is a certain grocery chain that operated for years on the principle that happy workers create happy customers. Their employee ownership model meant workers had a direct stake in the company's success. And their customer loyalty was extraordinary, not because of training, but because genuine care is actually recognizable to human beings. There is something important to notice about the companies that get this right. They almost all share one thing in common. They are either privately held, family-owned, or structured in ways that insulate leadership from the extreme short-term pressure of quarterly earnings reports. The financial structure changes the psychological priorities of the people at the top. Public companies face relentless pressure from shareholders who want returns now, not in 5 years. That pressure cascades down through every level of the organization. It hits compensation decisions, it hits staffing decisions, it hits how managers treat their teams. The psychological pressure at the top becomes the psychological damage at the bottom of the org chart. This is not an excuse for bad behavior. It is an explanation of the system that makes bad behavior so persistently rational from a certain narrow financial perspective. Until we change what we measure and reward at the top of the business system, the pattern at the bottom will keep repeating in industry after industry. Now let us talk about something that has been quietly building for the past several years. A growing movement among workers and researchers and even some business leaders who are saying loudly that this model is not just unfair, it is also bad business, and the evidence is mounting in ways that are increasingly hard to ignore. The Great Resignation of 2021 shocked a lot of companies. Millions of workers in customer-facing and service industries quit their jobs at once. Companies that had spent decades assuming workers had no real exit option suddenly discovered they were wrong. Workers quit, and the customer experience that those companies had carefully built fell apart almost overnight. Suddenly, companies that had ignored worker well-being for years found themselves desperate to fill roles they could not fill. And for perhaps the first time, many of these companies were forced to confront a question they had been successfully avoiding for decades. What happens to our customer experience when we treat our workers badly enough that they all leave? The answer was not pretty. Customer wait times exploded. Service quality collapsed. Brand reputations built over years took damage in months. And companies that had been proudest of their customer experience suddenly found themselves unable to deliver it because the people who delivered it were gone, and replacements were not walking through the door. This was a live demonstration of everything the service profit chain research had been saying for 30 years. Worker experience and customer experience are not separate. They are deeply intertwined. When you neglect one long enough, the other eventually breaks. The Great Resignation was not just a labor story, it was a customer experience story too. And yet, even after going through this, many companies reverted to their old behavior the moment the labor market shifted again. When unemployment rose and workers had fewer options, companies quietly pulled back the wage increases, reduced benefits, and began returning to the old familiar shortcuts. Present bias in action all over again, exactly as the research predicts. So what does the psychology of individual leaders inside these companies look like? Because at the end of the day, every policy, every culture, every decision comes from human beings making choices. And those human beings have their own psychological patterns, their own blind spots, and their own motivations that shape everything that happens inside their organizations. Many executives and managers genuinely believe they care about their employees. Studies show that most leaders rate themselves as far more empathetic and fair than their direct reports rate them. This gap is enormous and consistent across industries. The leaders are not all lying. Many of them genuinely do not see the gap that their employees live in every day. This is called the empathy gap in leadership research. Leaders become increasingly insulated from the day-to-day experience of frontline workers as they rise up the hierarchy. They stop experiencing what their workers experience. They lose the ability to feel what it feels like to be in those roles. And their decisions start reflecting that distance more and more. The physical and social distance between executives and frontline workers in large companies is enormous. The executive is in the headquarters. The worker is in the store. The executive meets customers at corporate events and in focus groups. The worker meets customers at their absolute worst and most demanding moments every single day without a break. There is also a powerful psychological phenomenon called attribution error at play. When a customer has a bad experience, executives tend to blame the worker. When an employee burns out or leaves, executives tend to attribute it to the individual. They say that person was not resilient enough, not a culture fit, not motivated enough to succeed here. They rarely ask the systemic question, why do so many people burn out in this specific role in this specific company? The individual framing protects the system from scrutiny. It keeps the policy intact while placing all the burden on the individual person who is broken by that policy. This pattern repeats endlessly in organizations of every size. Now let us talk about what happens to customers when they finally understand this dynamic, because this is actually changing. A new generation of consumers is increasingly aware of how companies treat their workers, and it is starting to affect purchasing decisions in ways that some companies are only beginning to take seriously at the boardroom level. Research consistently shows that younger consumers in particular are more likely to stop buying from companies they perceive as treating workers unfairly. They are also more likely to actively promote companies they believe genuinely care for their people. The consumer psychology is shifting, and it is shifting in a direction that should concern companies still running the old model. Social media has made the invisible visible in ways that fundamentally change this equation. An employee posting about their working conditions can reach millions of people overnight. A leaked internal memo about policy can go viral by morning. The opacity that companies relied on to maintain this gap between customer experience and employee experience is eroding fast. And when consumers see behind the curtain, when they see that the smiling worker on the advertisement is actually struggling behind the scenes, something shifts in how they feel about the brand. The customer experience feels less warm when you know it was extracted from someone who was not being treated with the same warmth in return. This is a really profound psychological shift, because it means the very strategy that companies use to build customer loyalty is now a potential source of customer disillusionment. The better job a company did of performing warmth through underpaid workers, the bigger the betrayal customers feel when they learn the truth behind that performance. So now we arrive at a genuinely interesting question. What would a company look like that actually built its customer experience on a foundation of genuine employee well-being rather than performed employee warmth? Not just superficially, but structurally in the actual policies, compensation practices, and culture from the very top of the organization down to the front line. The research actually tells us quite clearly what this looks like. It looks like living wages, not just technically above minimum wage, but genuinely enough to live on without a second job. It looks like real scheduling predictability, so workers can plan their lives. It looks like genuine benefits that make workers feel secure, not anxious about their basic needs. It also looks like psychological safety inside the workplace, the ability to raise concerns without fear of retaliation, the ability to say a customer is being abusive and have management back you up rather than side with the customer automatically. The experience of being treated as a full human being, not just a performance delivery mechanism for someone else's satisfaction. When workers have psychological safety, something remarkable happens. They become genuinely engaged in the customer experience, not just compliant with it. They problem solve creatively. They go beyond their job description because they want to, not because they are afraid not to. The quality of service that emerges from this is qualitatively different from trained performance. Customers can feel this difference even when they cannot name it. There is something about being helped by someone who genuinely wants to help you versus someone who is managing you through a script. The genuine version creates real loyalty. The scripted version creates temporary satisfaction that evaporates the moment something goes slightly wrong in the interaction. This is why companies that invest in their employees do not just get better satisfaction scores, they get different kinds of loyalty. Their customers are more forgiving when things go wrong. They give more benefit of the doubt. They recommend the company to others, not because of a loyalty points incentive, but because they actually experienced something that felt real. Now let us talk about what this psychology looks like from the inside at the management level. Middle managers are in a particularly difficult position in all of this. They are often the ones who genuinely care about their team, but are squeezed between the demands from above and the reality they see every single day below them. A middle manager who wants to protect their team from an unreasonable workload faces consequences from above if they push back too hard. A middle manager who wants to compensate their best workers fairly hits a ceiling set by corporate. They are trapped in the middle of a system they did not design and often cannot change no matter how much they want to. This creates something called moral distress in psychology. It is the experience of knowing the right thing to do, but being structurally prevented from doing it. Middle managers and companies with this culture experience moral distress at very high rates, and it contributes to their own burnout and disengagement over time. The damage travels up the chain too. So we have a system where the frontline worker is damaged by the gap between customer care and employee care. The middle manager is damaged by moral distress. The customer eventually becomes disillusioned when the truth becomes visible. And the company slowly hollows out its own foundation while reporting strong quarterly results for as long as the system holds together. The question is not whether this system eventually breaks. The research and the real-world evidence tell us clearly that it does break. The question is who pays the price when it breaks. And the answer consistently is that the workers pay first and most heavily. The executives typically exit with their compensation intact and move to the next company. There is a term for what happens when executives leave companies they have damaged while still collecting large rewards. It is called the accountability gap. And it is one of the most powerful reasons why the psychological incentive to change this behavior is so weak at the very top, where change would need to originate from. If the person making the decision to underinvest in employees never personally bears the cost of that decision, the psychological feedback loop that would normally correct bad behavior never activates. You learn to change behavior through consequences. Remove the consequences, and the behavior continues indefinitely, regardless of how clearly the data shows it is harmful to the system overall. Now here is something that does not get talked about enough: the effect of this dynamic on the way employees see themselves over time. When you work in an environment where customers are visibly valued more than you, the message you receive about your own worth is constant, and it goes very deep into how people understand their own value. Workers in these environments often internalize the message. They start to believe that the customer deserves better treatment than they do. They start to believe that their discomfort is just part of the job, that their needs are less important, that their feelings should not interfere with someone else's experience. That is a deeply damaging belief to carry around inside yourself, and it does not stay at work. People do not have a switch they flip when they leave the building. The way you are treated at work shapes the way you understand your own worth. Workers who are consistently devalued by their employers show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and reduced sense of agency in all areas of their life, not just at work. This is the true human cost of this business model. Not just the unfairness of the wage gap, not just the physical exhaustion of the work, but the slow, quiet psychological erosion of self-worth in millions of people who spend their working lives performing dignity and care for others while receiving neither in return from the institutions they work for. And when you zoom out and look at the scale of this, you realize we are talking about an enormous portion of the workforce. Service workers, retail workers, hospitality workers, healthcare workers, customer support agents. These are some of the most common jobs in the entire economy. The scale of this psychological harm is not small. It is enormous and mostly invisible. So what can actually change this? Because we have been laying out the problem and understanding it clearly, but understanding a problem and solving it are very different things, especially when the problem is baked into the financial incentives of an entire economic system, and the people with the power to change it mostly benefit from keeping it the same. One answer is consumer pressure. Choosing to spend money with companies that genuinely treat their workers well, and choosing to stop spending with companies that do not. This works slowly and imperfectly, but it does work. Enough consumer pressure over time changes the financial calculation at the top, and that is ultimately the language that boards respond to. Another answer is policy and regulation. Minimum wage laws, predictable scheduling requirements, right to disconnect protections, paid leave mandates. These create a floor below which the exploitation cannot go. They change the system-level incentives so that companies cannot gain a competitive advantage by treating workers worse than their competitors do to the workers below them. But perhaps the most powerful lever is cultural. The stories we tell about work, the values we celebrate, the leaders we hold up as models. When we celebrate a CEO for delivering profit by cutting worker compensation, we are sending a cultural signal about what matters. When we celebrate a leader for building a company where workers thrive, we send a very different signal. And this cultural shift is actually happening. Slowly and imperfectly, but it is happening. The conversation about worker dignity has moved from the margins to the mainstream in a way that it simply was not a generation ago. That shift in what we talk about and value eventually shapes what companies feel the pressure to do and who they hire into leadership. There is also something powerful that individuals inside organizations can do. Leaders at every level have more influence over their immediate culture than they sometimes realize. A manager who treats their team with genuine respect, who advocates for their people, and who refuses to pass down dehumanizing pressure is making a real difference in the lives of real people right now. The psychology of organizations is ultimately just the aggregated psychology of the individuals inside them making choices every single day. The system shapes those choices powerfully, but it does not determine them completely. And every person who chooses to treat the people around them with dignity is doing something that has real measurable effects on real human well-being in the world. So let us come back to that person on the customer service call. The one who was smiling while crying in the break room before their shift. They are not just a data point in a business model. They are a full human being with a life outside that phone call, and a psychological world shaped in part by how that company decides to treat them each day. The company that treats its customers better than its employees is not just making a business choice. It is making a statement about whose humanity it values. And the uncomfortable truth that we have been building toward this entire time is that how a company treats its least visible people tells you everything you actually need to know about what that company truly believes about human worth. The next time you have a great customer experience, take a moment to wonder about the person who delivered it. Ask yourself whether that warmth was genuine or extracted, whether that smile was freely given or carefully trained. Because the answer to that question is more important than the rating you leave on the app. And more companies are starting to realize that you are beginning to notice the difference